Hello, everybody. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Looks like we got a pretty good crew. Just kind of taking a look at the guest list. Wait another couple of minutes before we start our roll call. So I know we have at least one person out, but I'm going to go ahead and start with our roll call. And since today we are going to be talking about standard contract language, thought a fun little check-in question might be, what is a routine or activity that you engage in regularly? What is some of your standard behavior? Something regularly that you do. I think an easy one for this would probably be, you know, like a holiday tradition or family tradition or something like that. Or maybe you have some other routine in your life that just makes you feel centered, and so you like to do it on a regular basis. So I'm going to just start from the top. Let's go with Sweta.
Thanks, Mercedes. Hi, everyone. Sweta Mbati, her pronouns, housing policy analyst in the governor's office. Routine or activity, I think actually it's probably my morning walk with my dogs every morning. It's nice to get outside, to, you know, breathe some fresh air. It's like a good wake-up call, getting ready for the day. So that's my favorite routine, and it's, like you mentioned, Mercedes, very centering for me.
Lovely, thank you. Debbie.
Good morning. I think the one thing that I do every single day, the same way every time, is I make a pot of coffee, I pour the cup of coffee, and I sit in the same spot every single day and drink my first cup. And that helps me sort of wake up and get my thoughts organized for the day.
Very nice, thank you. Heather.
Gosh, I feel like my life's too chaotic to have a routine thing I do, but Heather Ficht, East Cascade Works. I think it's a couple times a week I hop in the hot tub with my oldest, my 15-year-old, and we actually get to have a chat. So it's our grounding connection time.
Nice. Tamara.
Of course, I just realized I was off of mute and turned it on. Good morning, everyone. Tamara, Native American Youth and Family Center. She, her pronouns. And thank you, Heather, for sharing that you don't feel like you have a lot of routine. I was like, regular routine. But I think one of my favorites is reading on a Saturday or reading in the evening when I know I'm going to want to stay up later than I should. And at least I'm reading an engaging book if I'm doing that.
Very nice. Way to use the energy, steer into the skid. Katrina. Katrina just yet? And I think we knew that person was out. All right, Felicita.
Morning, everyone. Felicita, North or South Foundation. I definitely like to have my cup of green tea every morning as just a way to start the day. Even when I'm traveling, it just makes me a nicer person. Thanks.
Very nice. Bettina. No Bettina yet. Marianne? No Marianne yet. Leah? Or Helen?
Hi. I read almost every night, usually bestsellers from like 3 years ago because I can't get anything more recent. So, very committed to my Libby app, and yeah, it's a good way to unwind.
Very nice. And then I would say, I think I definitely have a little morning wake up routine that I think really helps me get started in the day, including like picking out what earrings I'm going to wear, what kind of mood am I in? What am I trying to show out? But I do think one thing that I really enjoy is I have this really nice couch. It's like a big round circle and I can fit all in it, with my legs up in the chair and everything. And just sitting there and kind of watching the sky turn from light to dark is always a pleasure. Okay, so I think we've gotten all of the non-legislative members. Senator Campos, are you here? Would you like to check in for roll call? Or Representative Conrad?
Good morning. I am here. It's good to be back. Good to see you guys.
Welcome. Did you want to share anything that you do, your regular routine, since we're talking about contract standard language today? Anything that you do standard in your life?
There's a lot. I didn't catch the beginning questions. I didn't answer. But in the morning, yeah, I do read. I read a lot of nonfiction, and it just helps get my mind right and get the juices flowing for the day before I actually get into work. So every morning I try to read for about an hour.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. I do see that we have a hand up. So I'm not sure if that's going to be for public comment in our audience. But if it is, before I invite that person in, I just want to say thank you everybody for doing that check-in question with me. Since today we're talking about standard contract language, I think it's also good to think about where does routine feel like hard work and where does routine feel like really supportive and foundational work. So I think that's some of the tension we're going to be grappling with around this recommendation. So do we have anyone here for public comment? Was that hand in our audience somebody who wanted to share with us? Carla?
Hey, everybody. That wasn't my hand, but I do want to share it with you all. So,
Okay.
okay. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm a senior fellow and director of the American Worker Project at the Center for American Progress, which is a nonpartisan think tank located in Washington, D.C. And my research really focuses on improving the economic security of American workers. And I've done extensive research as part of this on the mechanisms and benefits of raising standards on government-supported work. So really excited about the work you all are doing. I and other members of my team received outreach from some of your members to talk about some of the work we've done to raise standards for nonprofit workers and the work you all are doing specifically on nonprofit workers to raise standards for those workers whose jobs are funded through government contracts. Unfortunately, low wages for contract workers is not a problem that is unique to Oregon, but there is a lot that cities and states have done to ensure that when the government is spending money, they're supporting high quality jobs. Yet we find that still all too often government spending is subsidizing low wages, and that contributes to problems that are not just problems for those workers, but also problems for attracting and retaining a well-qualified workforce and ensuring good value for the public. So we recently released a report that really details best practices in government spending, that includes guidance on a number of different policy mechanisms, including careful review of decisions to contract out, introducing contractor wage and benefit standards like living wage and prevailing wage, and reviewing contractors' responsibility records and ensuring that employees can exercise their right to unionize. And the report that I shared probably too recently, but that I shared in the submission of public comments thing, features both like the key features of strong policies, where governments have adopted best practices, and research demonstrating the benefit. So for example, when we're looking at prevailing wage laws, we know that they're important because they establish a floor that ensures that the government isn't undercutting the market. They ensure that workers are earning decent wages and benefits. And the report really provides guidance on what sort of spending can be covered, how to set those wages, and how to enforce standards. So I think it'll be hopefully quite useful for your work. We've also been doing work on wage boards, ensuring that in targeted industries, we bring together government, workers, organizations, and employers to negotiate wages and workplace standards. So that may also be of interest, and I'm happy to share materials on that as well. So I'd love to be of assistance with you as you all work through your recommendations in this space. And I just want to encourage you all, if it's helpful, to reach out. I've included contact information again on the public comments, and would be happy to have additional conversations in a more structured way. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for sharing. And just to reiterate for folks, it sounds like there was written documentation that was added to our public comment portal. So please be sure that you're checking that out, just on the website for the task force. Okay. I don't see any more hands, so I think we're good on there. So you can see on the agenda there, Amy, maybe if you can scroll up just a little. We're going to go through our agency presentations on standard contract language. Then we'll take a break, and then we will have the DASC risk management presentation. And then we'll do our regular kind of look ahead. We'll take a look at what we have planned or projected to be planned for the May agenda. I do want to kind of highlight that we're getting to the end of presentation and listening mode. So I would say I think presentations are going to be probably pretty short in May. And then it's really going to be us using the time to talk about how we want to start formulating these recommendations, pulling forward comments that we've made in previous discussions, things that may lean towards recommendations. Also in that look ahead, we're going to talk about the questions that we had for the Department of Justice, and we'll review that one more time. I'm gonna keep agency presentations hopefully to about 10 minutes today, just so we really make sure we have ample time for that DASC presentation and for the look ahead. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in. Department of Administration, you are up first.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. So today's presentation is about standard contracting language. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Amy, if you want to go to the next slide. So we tried to break this out. We weren't quite sure. We tried to break it out into where we have standard language for grant agreements, and then when we have standard language for more of the contracts that are a result of a procurement. So you'll see me kind of flipping between the two topics. So as we've talked about in previous meetings, DASC is responsible for 3 different types of grants. They are all sort of directed to us from the legislature. We have linked some samples of our templates. We do use a template for each one of those types And then once we have the specifics, we fill in the template, and they do have to be reviewed by DOJ. And then the bond counsel also reviews the ones that are capital finance agreements. We have shared these with other state agencies that have inquired, with the caveat that modifications usually have to be made to make sure that our document meets the needs of the agency and the program requirements. Next slide. So then when we talk about our procurements and the contracts that result from those, we actually have, there's a statute that requires DAS to work with DOJ to provide a series of templates. And so when those are provided, they are then required to be used by other state agencies. And so here is a list of some of our templates that we have under that category. One is an invitation to bid. And well, the first three actually are solicitation documents. They're not really contract documents, but those are the ones that we use when we are soliciting bids or proposals. And then the final three are types of contract documents that we have available that are templates. So those are out and available for other agencies to use. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of our grant agreements, the question is, how much does legislative language sort of drive what goes into the contracts and or disrupt templates that we have? So legislative language is usually limited. In our case, it's usually limited to the project description. And so we don't find that it has been disruptive to the limited amount of grant contracting that DAS does. There are sometimes federal requirements that also have to be fed into our grant templates. Next slide. Okay, so bridging funding cycles. And the question here is, do we have any recommendations on how to do this more effectively, bridge our funding cycles? For grants, we don't really have any recommendations to offer. Again, our experience in the grant realm is pretty specific and limited. So our lottery revenue bonds and our ARPA grants, they do often span multiple biennia, and so we haven't really had any problems receiving the additional limitation to meet those longer timelines. For procurements, we also don't have a lot of recommendations here. I believe that DAS and other agencies often do include renewal language, so such that and our standard agreements always include language that says we can terminate the agreement if we don't get appropriated the funds to continue forward. Next slide. Improving review and execution speed. So again, just looking for recommendations here. The best recommendation that we can offer is that agencies be granted some additional authority to approve contracts when we are using pre-approved templates without modification. So if a template has been created and it has been approved by DOJ and any other sort of governing body, then it would be great if additional authority could be granted to sort of rinse and repeat the same template if we aren't modifying it. And there are complications with that as well, ensuring that the template meets the business needs. But I think that's an area that could have some further exploration. Next slide. What drives contract and grant language changes from year to year? It's typically legislation. So if there is a new law or a new policy passed, then we typically have to not only go through and make sure that our templates are up to date, but at times we do have to do some amendments to existing agreements. Next slide. approving contracts for 24 months or more. So again, this is focused on our grant agreements. The lottery bond grants are usually a 3-year grant. And so we are accustomed to entering into that 3-year agreement and then going into the next biennium asking for that additional funding. And then ARPA grants are driven by federal timelines, and they can extend beyond the 24 months. And these, we usually distribute the funds once the grant agreement is executed, but then the reporting period is what carries on and crosses over into a different biennium. Next slide. Upfront and startup funding. And so again, we split this one up. So for grants, the question is, what would we need to do to be able to do this? And so we wanted to share that for the ARPA grants, there's a federal mandate for emergency funding to be distributed quickly, and a desire by the legislature to get the money into the hands of the grantees so they can get those projects started really quickly. And so then for the lottery bonds, the grants just don't allow for upfront or startup funding. And so all those funds are distributed once we get the contract in place. They're not reimbursable. So we do distribute the funds once the contract is there. Next slide. So for procurements, this is a little trickier. We do have statewide accounting and procurement rules that would have to be reviewed to see if rule changes would have to be made in order to make this possible. We typically, on our contracts and procurement side, we pay in arrears. So the product or service is delivered, it's verified that it's been delivered and performed satisfactorily, we receive an invoice and we make payment. So I believe that our finance policies are set up for that scenario. So it could be that there could be some modifications or an exception process that would allow for piloting some of these startup or upfront arrangements. Also, if we did sort of implement that more broadly, we would really want to put in place some guidance for agencies to use so they could make some good decisions on when to use this type of funding, when it makes sense, what are the risks, and how to really administer those contracts to ensure that once the money has been sent out the door, the work is being conducted appropriately. Next slide. Okay, that's what I thought. So that's the end of the DAS presentation. Happy to answer questions or move along.
I did have one question. When you shared the templates that you all do, I think I missed, did you say that agencies have to use those or agencies can use those?
On the procurement side, if DAS has published a template under the requirements of the statute that was referenced on that slide, then state agencies and the executive branch do have to use that template. So yes, Amy pulled it back up for me here. So not all of the DAS templates have been created under this umbrella of 279A.157, but if they have, then those templates do need to be used.
Representative Conrad, I see your hand.
Thank you, and thank you for that. I'm trying to reconcile in my head, when I was with Lane County Parks, OSMB would provide an annual upfront grant to help and maintain boat docks. And so trying to reconcile what you said about the upfront cost, because some agencies can already do that. And if during the time of that annual grant, we didn't meet the requirements of it by providing garbage, bathrooms, a couple of the other things that we had to have, that would be deducted from the following year's grant, or we would have to pay it back. So some agencies already have that, but from what I heard you say is that that might be a agency by agency or a new process that have to happen. So just trying to reconcile how one agency can already do that, but yet statewide agencies can't, and what we would need to do at the legislature up front for that granting those projects. Do we need to add a new term for some of those that would say upfront costs can be, and then whatever the right legalese after that might follow?
Okay, thank you for the question, Representative. So I think I probably muddied the water. When I was speaking about the statewide accounting rules, I was talking specifically about procurements and contracts, not grants. So yes, there are grants that the funding can be provided up front, and that has to do with the agency's grant authority and the way that the grant funds have been made available. But when we are spending money out of our run rate budget and we are contracting for services or goods that's not a grant, that is when our accounting rules tend to direct us to make sure we have received the product or the service before we make payment.
Can I follow up real quick on that?
Yeah, of course.
Are there times that you are aware of when, for a contract, that money is provided up front? Again, with Lane County, we usually did exactly what you're talking about, but there were exceptions for making down payments, and we would, particularly on the invoices, we would have that, whatever X percentage is required for upfront fees for to secure that contract, and or to begin that ordering process. For ordering metal buildings for shops. Or if for construction services, they would want some upfront, and we just have that specifically itemized on that invoice, and we'd follow through to make sure that it was done. But it happens. Is that what happens at the state? Can you tell me a little bit more? Again, trying to look for what we need to do at the legislature.
You bet. So yes, it does happen. I will say that agencies tend to want to follow the rules that are in our statewide accounting manual. And so it is not a common practice, but I do know of situations where exceptions have been made. Agencies have accepted the risk of making an upfront payment. I think my comments were intended to say, if we wanted to explore this more broadly and make it a payment methodology that we want to socialize and get agencies comfortable with, I think we would probably need to do some review of our accounting manual and also ensure that we have guidance documents and decision-making tools available for agencies so that they really understand how to differently manage those resulting contracts than the ones where we are paying after the fact.
Great, thank you very much.
You bet.
That was a great dialogue. Thank you so much for that, Debbie. And I think it also really helped me to hear you talk about, when I think of upfront payments, I'm thinking about like expediency, efficiency, getting programs on the ground. And I'm hearing you say risk. And so that is good. That is good for, I think, just contextualizing it. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I think we'll see you again later. Department of Early Learning and Care, you're up.
Good morning. I want to start by saying I'm extremely glad that DAS went first, because that does cover some of the things that I think all of us will be presenting on today when it comes to ultimately where we go for some things. And I'm just trying to pull up my slideshow here really quickly. And I don't think I hit share screen first, so I may have just messed that up. Hold on here. We'll go. Forgive me, you're going to see this for just a brief moment. It's not my plan. And come on, there we go. And does everyone see the slide now? Thank you. All right. The sun is out at my house, so I'm like extra chipper right this minute. But I'm really happy to be presenting today on the contracting language and multi-year contract terms. I do have Lori here And Lori, I always say your last name wrong, but she is our Director of Procurement. I'm going to say Nordline. But she's our Director of Procurement at Delk, so she's also partnering because there are definitely things about this that she's the expert on and I am not. But together we have put this information together. I want to start with agency templates. We do use DAS templates as a baseline for contract boilerplate and the development of our agreements. While the statements of work will vary from program to program, we do have those standards. That's one of the reasons that we didn't really submit templates, because we use the DAS templates for our contracts. However, we can provide some samples of our work. DOJ reviews and provides legal sufficiency approval for our agreements, and Delk maintains our own template information. I don't know of any agency that uses a copy of one of our agreements to create their own. They might, but it's not necessarily with us saying, here's a template. We are working on some templates at this point, especially for our tribal agreements, so that we have some things in kind of the library that have been pre-worked on with DOJ and our tribal nations to ensure that we're meeting the expectations for that work. Legislative influence on language. Boilerplate contracting and granting language is typically not influenced by the legislature. And when it is, DAS lets us know. Statements of work are where we can see the biggest impacts to new or changes to existing statutes. We will review for impact. We have a feedback loop that includes, at times, as appropriate, community engagement, both with existing grantees and potentially with the public. We do work to communicate those changes out and go to DOJ for review to make sure that we're implementing with the best interpretation of that language. Bridging funding cycles. So we don't have a lot of recommendations about how to bridge funding cycles. A lot of it is the tight cutoff between end of session and the time it takes to do all the things necessary to put the funding in place. So the mitigating strategies we have are our agreement timing. We try to make sure, and this is newer for us as being our own agency, but we're working very hard to ensure that the timeline of our agreements has them in place in July of a biennium, so that as soon as that funding is available, we're ready to just load funding into our awards management system. One of the things that we do have to do because of that is, while we may have agreements in place at the beginning of July, we do have to do amendments often post-session for any adjustments that occurred during the legislative session that we didn't account for in our efforts to get those agreements in place in a timely manner. But it's usually just funding amendments. And I know I can say just funding amendments, and Lori's like, yeah, that's a workload too. But funding, at least the agreements are in place so that grantees and contractors can draw on funds right away while we're doing the amendment process. For us to improve speed of agreements, we have a really good timeline with DOJ at this point. That's not to say at some point workload issues at DOJ or the overabundance of work we might give to DOJ couldn't change that. But at the moment, we feel like our timeline is reasonable and appropriate for the work that we submit. The times that things do get bogged down is potentially specific grantee or contractor requests that we have to go back and forth to get things where they need to be. And in some areas, we're working on understanding the most common things that we go back and forth with, like with universities or with tribal nations, to iron a lot of that out and have a better understanding so that we can avoid that in the future. We try to have our agreements prepared in advance of whatever the execution date needs to be, usually July 1, just so that our legal sufficiency is done and we're ready to roll and we're not delayed because of any of the administrative tasks that go into preparing agreements. Some of the drivers of contract and grant language changes. At times we receive feedback, both internal and external, regarding the work of a program. And after reviewing that feedback, this could result in updates to a statement of work, changes to reporting requirements, insurance requirements, or other areas. Usually it's because we've gotten greater clarity and understanding of how the work is done. Not necessarily saying, and I'm sorry, I put you in the middle of that slide, not necessarily saying that we didn't know how the work was done, but greater understanding about the boots on the ground people who are doing the work and what barriers we may or may not have in there. So to help us do that better. We work to only make necessary changes to agreements. And sorry, we work only to make necessary agreements changes, sorry. Statutory changes to existing program agreements are rare. It's usually the statement of work area. And then when we have new programs, we could see a year over year or a biennium over biennium change for the first few cycles while we're really getting a program in place. Conditions for agreements over 24 months. Well, funding availability across biennia, because agreements do end if the funding's not continued. So that keeps it past 24 months. We still need to do amendments. So we could put a 4-year agreement out, but chances are there will be inflationary increases or other funding changes that we'll have to amend. And then programmatic updates. We may have to amend because some of the requirements of a program may have changed, some of the work may have changed. The good thing about that is agreements remain in effect during the amendment process, which allows us to administer funding during that time. As an example, and we're in the process of putting our fairly simple grant agreement for asset forfeiture funds for relief nurseries out. And because those funds are not, they don't go back to the legislature at the end of a biennium. These are asset forfeiture. They come from a different place. We're able to work those agreements out until June of 2027, so that all we will need to do is amend for additional asset forfeiture funds that come in, which will make it much easier to just keep those rolling over time. That's a rare occurrence. It's not a typical funding stream or agreement process, but we absolutely are looking at a lot of our agreements, especially our system agreements, being for 4 years. We looked at it at the beginning of DELC and decided the beginning of DELC was too soon to do it. So let's give ourselves some time to get settled first. Payment in advance or startup funding. We do allow advance payments. So once an agreement's executed, a grantee, and I'll just put a program in mind, preschool promise grantees, typically their program doesn't start until September. But they may be doing staff training and need to pay staff for their time or do preparation for services. So they can draw down funds, but they do have to provide an expenditure report on how those funds were spent once they spend those funds. We do offer startup, typically for new grantees or new programs, usually to help with initial costs to meet requirements, to bridge where they're at. Usually that means things like classroom furniture, playground resources, building updates. Specifically does not include what are considered capital improvements or building purchases. These are just ways to make sure that, again, as Preschool Promise as an example, if you have a new program, they may be the best early learning program you could want, but their classroom furniture doesn't quite suit the environment. So we're going to let them take some startup and improve their environment before the first day of classes. That's it. I tried to keep it under 10, and I know I did because I've been watching the clock. Anyway, sorry. Any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions for you in the chat. If we do see anything, we'll send you something for a written response. But I think that was great. And yeah, almost exactly 10 minutes. I think I got like 30 seconds here. All right, Helen, you want to take those 30 seconds?
Perfect.
Sure. Sorry, camera's off. It's having some internet instability, but I just am curious about the authority for how you're even making the adjustments you mentioned. I've heard specifically from, grantees saying like, we don't understand why DELC can do something, but other agencies can. The process with DELC has been really easy comparatively. So that's a complete compliment. And I'm just trying to understand how we can widen that.
I think a lot of it does have to do with our statutory authority. Startup is allowed in preschool promise grants, in other grants, especially working with our procurement partners to make sure that when we do an RFA process for our grants, that we are actually asking them to apply for how they might need those funds up front. So it's just part of the agreement in total. It's not a scenario where, and our grant manuals also talk about when a grantee can draw down funds ahead of expenditures. I can look to pull some statute and rule for you, but really I think a lot of it is just the nature of the work that we do and the nature of the programs we work with, that it's recognized that not everything is going to be an expenditure-based process, and we do have to be willing to front some money. Again, always with the need to document those expenses and get a reconciliation of the funding ultimately. So it's not just going out the door with no documentation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think if you want to share maybe even some excerpts from your what did you call it, your manual?
Or grant manuals?
Anywhere
Yep.
where you see, anywhere you see some language that you feel like has helped make that process, I think that would be great if you're able to send that as a supplement.
Yes, I will pull a compilation of different things together and send it.
Thank you so much. All right, and we'll ask Department of Human Services to come on up.
Good morning. My name is Kirk Rhodes, and I'm the administrator for the Office of Contracts and Procurement, which is a shared services office that serve and support Oregon Department of Human Services, Oregon Health Authority, Home Care Commission, PEB, or Public Employees Benefit Board, and OEB, which is Oregon Educators Benefit Board. So if you'll bear with me, I will share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Thank you. So the first question was regarding templates. Who writes and maintains these? We maintain the grant templates that have been created by DAS and DOJ. We have what we call a language library, which is a group of our staff who stay current and synchronized with updates and the analysis that goes on prior to our subsequent to the legislative session and after the DOJ model rule update and DAS update. Anyway, we have a group that's specifically set aside to do this. So these templates, again, they're written by DOJ and DAS, and then we update anything that comes along. Are these templates used by other state agencies? We have on many occasions shared our templates. There's a provision for the procurement officers to write and modify some templates at the 150,000 and beneath. So these are ones that would we would keep, and they're really kind of oddballs that would be specific agency specific kind of things, and we see these in ODHS. These are short forms that are used for placement with children and that kind of thing. So these are agreements and templates that we have. These are templates that we have worked with DOJ to develop for specific uses, and we have shared. How much does the legislative language determine contract language or create or disrupt? I wouldn't say that it disrupts. It just, we have to update, and in accordance with and this is heavily on the contract side. So under the procurement code, ORS 279 A, B, and C, we would update and in accordance with what the legislature passes. On the granting side, the key, because we do so many, we do very few general fund grants, very few. So it's typically federal funding, and the notice of granting award and the provisions, terms and conditions from those NOAAs have to go into our agreements. So yeah, that's kind of the split there. So it's not a disruption, it's just an addition that would be added to either the statements of work, special terms and conditions, potentially the boilerplate. Does your agency have recommendations on how to bridge different funding cycles that affect contract terms and funding sustainability? We have, and actually this is language that has come from DOJ, non-appropriation language. So in the event that an agreement would span the biennia, there is a provision to where if this is not appropriated, the funding for it's not appropriated, that it would be terminated. The agreement could be terminated. We write multiple year contracts, typically with the grants that are general. They would have to be distributed within the biennia. The federal can cross federal fiscal years, and those again are accounted for annually with the September 30th, 1 October delineation. So yes, we do write. I think we did a run on an earlier presentation. We did an analysis of the average time that grants and contracts were written for, and I think we were up around the 3.6 or 3.7 level. So yes, we do write agreements that span biennia. What recommendations does your agency have for improving the speed of review and execution of new and existing contracts? I think with what's been said earlier, I agree with using the templates are advantageous if they're developed and implemented in such a way that if the language is not changed, then that expedites. DOJ can be comfortable with the fact that it hasn't been changed, any of the template. They can move through faster through legal sufficiency review and all the other thresholds that would need to be broached. So I think templates, and not altering the templates are a great way to do that. I think it expedites it through the DOJ side, and it makes it exponentially easier for the writer to really be concerned with, the coherent statement of work development, program description development on the granting side. So we have the program description in the grant, and we have a statement of work in the contract. What drives contract grant language changes from year to year? And again, that would be changes in from the legislature that would impact specific programs. We'll have changes, for child welfare within that program space. We'll have them for APD. We'll have them for VR occasionally. Anyway, those are typically the changes that we'll see. Now on the contract or on the granting side, especially the federal side, I think most recently the OMB, I believe this is in effect. Most recently, the OMB has approved a de minimis from 10 to 15%. So that's good news for the federal granting side and our partners. So yep, that will change. What are the conditions that would need to be present to approve a contract for 24 months or more? And really that is, it's kind of driven by the program budget, the legislatively approved budget, any sort of conditions on the granting side that would be delimiting with regards to time. And there may be, and we'll see that on the federal side too, they will delimit it to a certain period of time. It doesn't necessarily align with the federal fiscal year. It could extend beyond that, say that it's 2 years to expend these funds or 3 or something like that. They could say that, and I've seen that. Okay, under what conditions would the agency approve upfront or startup funding at the start of a new contract or grant agreement and or at the beginning of a new biennium for ongoing contracts? So this really is something that's done quite often with our grants. And really the emphasis and I would say the real push in looking at this model with granting was for community-based organizations and helping to develop some of our community-based organizations that we work with, and so many of them, and we have expanded beyond just the healthcare side of things, because with disaster relief now with Orem, which is our disaster relief section, we have, we're looking at some types of services that are commensurate with what ODOT would see, with debris removal and excavation, that kind of thing. So it's given us a different glimpse at kind of a different business sectors. So this is something that is done quite frequently with granting. On the contract side, it does have to be tempered with, as stewards of the public resources, we have to, look at these very carefully when we're really set up for deliverable based with contracts. And that's really how the finance and accounting system rolls. But there are ways to do this on the contracting side too. And that needs to be very, very closely developed and watched post-execution by the contract administration staff and the vendor. Questions?
Well, that was exactly 10 minutes, so it was very good.
Well, thank you.
I think I'll ask folks, thank you for that presentation. I think I'll ask folks, if you do have questions, please put those in the chat for a written response, and we're going to keep on moving down our list. Thank you so much. So that makes Oregon Health Authority. You're up next.
Awesome. Thank you. This is Melissa Hanks, everyone. Let me get ready to share my screen and then we'll get started. Can everyone see that?
Looks good.
Wonderful. All right. So good morning, everyone. This is Melissa Hanks from the Oregon Health Authority. We are presenting today about our standard and flexible contract language and multi-year contract terms. Kirk did note that OC&P and OHA do share, or DHS and OHA share an OC&P office. And so what Kirk talked about with regards to templates is going to be what we're going to talk about a little bit. So we'll go through that pretty fast. Also, Dolly and Jordan are here from the Public Health Division, And Steve Phillips is here from OC&P, so they may be stepping in to help with some questions. All right. So as Kirk mentioned, we have templates that we use that are from DAS, and they involve DOJ for grants, pass-through grants, and personal professional services contracts. The templates are developed in OC&P as part of the language library team that Kirk mentioned of consultants. The templates are reviewed by DOJ for approval and use. Currently, OC&P is working on modifying the personal services contract template with DAS for us to use, and updates are made on an as-needed basis, and changes are approved by DOJ prior to general use. As Kirk also mentioned, we do share our grant template with other state agencies. We're not sure how often it's being used or how widespread the use is, but we have been sharing it with other agencies over the years. All right, how much does legislative language determine contract language and or create or disrupt templates that are used? So when statutes are created or modified, this results in changes to the terms and conditions in the template. So the changes are made as soon as required by a new statute or a change to an existing statute, and the templates are then modified and approved by DOJ for the more general use. So we make the changes pretty much as soon as we have to by new statute or change. Changes that come from programs are handled with the customers and then included in the new contract or grant actions where needed. Those changes are usually made through amendments to current contracts and grant agreements, and they're usually focused on the statement of work for a contract or the program description for grants. All right, so does your agency have recommendations for how to bridge different funding cycles that affect contract terms and funding sustainability? Yes, we do. We have a lot of experience with this, especially recently. Our first recommendation is to flex the agency's ability to encumber funds before the next biennial budget is set, making an allowance or providing a contingency for a percentage of funds to be set aside to bridge that gap between the end of the current biennium or session and the next legislatively approved biennial budget. The next recommendation is to create multiple grants with the same CBO based on funding type, so we can strategically use the flexibility of federal funding and the schedule that comes with federal funds to carry over on a federal fiscal year basis versus a state fiscal year basis. Some limitations that we have that goes with the next slide. Hang on just a moment. All right, next, target funding and contract extensions adjustments to fill the gap. For example, this is something that public health equity grants have been doing. Public health implemented a bridge funding approach in the 21-23 biennium to support the CBOs who were going to continue into the next biennium. They were originally funded in the middle of the 21-23 biennium, and they got 6 months of bridge funding to prevent the interruption to the funding while we awaited the adoption of the 23-25 budget. This extended their agreements for 6 months at the 21-23 current service level, and then award adjustments were made for the remaining 18 months after the budget was finalized. This is an approach that we customarily use for funding local public health authorities as well. All right, what recommendations does your agency have for improving the speed of review and execution of new or existing contracts? So largely it falls into the areas of staffing, making sure that we increase staffing in the OHA program, in OC&P, in the OHA divisions, in fiscal and budget, and in DAS. We have so much work going on, and we don't have enough staff to do it across the board. We often have 1 or 2 staff members managing hundreds of contracts. And one of the recommendations we saw was having an OCP contact assigned to each program and increasing the staffing at OCP and DAS to handle all of the activity going on. Streamlining the review process by developing and implementing standardized templates and checklists, and then providing training for staff involved in the evaluation process to speed that up. Most of our time is spent in developing new or changing existing contracts. in development of the statement of work or the scope of work, and then trying to align that with the program intent or the funding requirements. We have to make sure there's a consistent approach and resources for planning, and that will significantly improve the speed of review when everybody kind of understands what the intent is and what the limitations are. You can save a lot of time in the back and forth on creating that. Similar to delegated contracting authority, we might consider something like DOJ providing training on legal sufficiency review, and then following training, allowing units to conduct that under delegated authority. And then we also work on the signature routing process. We've made a lot of improvements in implementing DocuSign CLM, and it's really improved the efficiency. And so we could improve that efficiency in other units and sections too by adopting that. We continue to look at, and implement those things. And really it's about making sure that we are keeping track of these recommendations and continuing to move them forward, not just at the agency level, but at the shared services and then at the program and division levels too. All right, what drives contract and grant language changes from year to year? These are the main drivers of change that I collected from our subject matter experts across the agency. Change to agency priorities, program feedback and OC&P feedback, programmatic need and community input. Those two things go together a lot more lately than they used to. Funding availability, changes to state or federal requirements, administrative burden, the level of program engagement and active administration of the activities, which of course can move things to a contract from a grant, and then contractor performance and cost. What are the conditions that would need to be present to approve a contract for 24 months or more? Mostly what we look at is a stable funding source, having the funding type and the amounts of funding available to allocate, and understanding how those funds are supposed to be used. Demonstrating a need for a longer term contract and understanding the continuing service level needs. The ability to meet all the reporting requirements, and use of the risk assessment process to determine longer term and ongoing partnerships, and using that assessment data to further support CBOs in making longer term planning. With some programs, we regularly extend more than 24-month agreements based on the funding availability. Ideally, we would do it at about 60 months with a periodic review of performance. Under what conditions would the agency approve upfront or startup funding? If funding is available, we can only make the funding with state funds with few, if any, exceptions. If the upfront funding is necessary for successful implementation, if it's in line with our budget and priorities, if the contractor or grantee is a continuing partner with a good history of successful performance, if the contractor is a small business with limited capital to invest. This can include adding capacity, diversifying services, to meet the contractor solicitation requirements. If there are changes to funding timelines, like there are shortened funding timeframes because of expenditure deadlines, or if there's an anticipated delay in receiving funds. If the funding includes investment in infrastructure or capital expenditures like vehicles for established contractors in good standing. If the funding is to cover startup costs to meet the startup criteria aligned in statute and rule. And funding is to cover a funding gap in the budget cycle, the bridge funding that we just talked about. The requirements to monitor and adjust upfront funding. When reimbursement is involved, we have to adjust based on what's billed, invoiced, or submitted for Medicaid claims. The contractor has to provide a detailed line item budget and then a reconciliation within a reasonable time period. We look at about 12 months maximum. OHA can then amend the monthly payments in the quarterly reconciliation process to reduce or increase the funds as needed. And then we update the terms and conditions associated with the risk mitigation of upfront funding. And that's it. Are there any questions?
It looks like we've got one in the chat, and we've got a little less than a minute if you want to take that question.
Excellent. Thank you for that question, Rep. Conrad. That is a question I'm going to have to take back. I know that it really depends on the unit and the amount of work they're doing, so it's not that way across the entire agency. That may just represent, like, for example, behavioral health contracts or Medicaid contracts for certain providers. So let me take that back and work on it, and I will come back with more information.
Thank you. I appreciate
Dolly.
that. Just real quick, this is Rep. Conrad again. One of the things I'm looking at Lane County, we used to have, somebody would do the contract, but they don't have to go up to various levels of approval. And the higher level you go, the more work those positions already have. And so it would take months just to get it through the upper echelons to get their approvals as well. So some of that I'm looking at that internal chain of command. And is there a way to give the people the authority at the first level to get some of these done? And I don't know if that's the same for OHA or not, but that's some of what I'm thinking about. So I appreciate you getting back.
This is Dolly England with the Public Health Division. I can answer just briefly for our Public Health Equity Grant. There is one person at OCMP that processes all 200 and so odd of our contracts. And where the edits come in is when we want to make amendments to those contracts. So for example, if we get more money and we want to push more money out to community, all of the contracts then have to be amended. The process looks the same at every other step. We have 2 people in fiscal, then managing the contracts and all of the budgets and the payments. So we really would benefit from having additional staff to help process contracts and payments quickly or more fast than we are now.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, OHA. Okay, and we'll go ahead and invite the Higher Education Coordinating Commission up. And OHA staff, you are still sharing your screen.
Don't worry, I'm going to override that. All right, thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen. Get acknowledgement. Thank you, perfect. Okay, so I'm with the Higher Education Coordinating Commission and talking about standard contracting language and flexibility. Do we have standard contract language that permits flexibility to contract terms, conditions, who writes and maintains these templates? Are there other templates used by other state agencies? We select the form of agreement based on the, it's going back to kind of what we established in the early infancy of this task force. What defines a grant versus a contract? And so that analysis really determines which form that we use. If we're obtaining goods or services, it's most likely going to be a purchase order, or it's going to be a personal services contract. Purchase orders, like 3 pages. Personal services contract is based on the DAS template. That's about 25 pages, can be longer based on the statement of work. We also have a few different flavors of grant agreements. We have kind of a standard issue grant agreement that we've developed over time in consultation with Department of Justice and responsive to programmatic needs. Some programs are within HEC are very unique. For example, Oregon SERS has a very unique grant agreement that includes a lot of federal terms and conditions and guidelines. Doesn't look anything like our standard issue grant agreement template. We also have a spinoff of our standard grant agreement template for universities and community colleges. We actually apply that same one to other public entities like local workforce boards. That's because we kind of treat them on the same playing field. We don't require specific specific insurance products. We use contributory language as an exhibit to those grant agreements after consultation with DAS risk management, helping guide us in that. So our contracts are very much based on DAS procurement templates for those. We have had to update them in response to past issues. Very rare that those happen, but occasionally we'll update those. And also some of the provisions we've clarified. Yes, so, and then our grant agreement has really evolved over time. I would say it changes slightly year to year, really based in reaction to issues that our 8 offices face administering grant agreements. Some of it's in response to outcomes of litigation. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Department of Justice, um, I can't say that. I can't reshare their legal advice. But I will say that we changed our practice um, to require certificates of insurance for grants and contracts up front before executing the agreement. And that was to mitigate risk of litigation and potential claims that insurance was not actually required. So that slide. How much does legislative language determine the contract language or disrupt templates? I wouldn't say it disrupts templates at all. I would say legislative language very much substantially informs the resulting contract or grant agreement. Focusing mostly on grant agreements, we really have to incorporate the legislation gives us the box in which we play in the sand, so to speak. So we can't exceed the scope of the legislative intent or wording. So if it states, HEC shall issue a grant opportunity for workforce ready programs targeting priority populations as defined by this other statute. That is the world in which we live in, and that's what our grant agreement will reflect. Sometimes there's a conflict in what the statute states and what our attorneys advise us on. So one that I've seen, and I don't know if this is a disconnect between legislative counsel that advises lawmakers on how to write bills. And maybe not all bills are getting that set of eyes by legislative counsel. I don't know. That process is a mystery to me. But I will tell you, once law is enacted and we are trying to implement it, a frequent issue we've encountered is violations of equal protection clause. That is treating some citizens of the state on a different playing field than others based on protected statuses. So age, disability, gender, race, nationality. And those are, I've seen a few times in the last couple cycles, legislative cycles, legislation that targets those specific protected classes and giving favoritism or, on the flip side, discriminating against those protected classes, neither of which are within the confines of statutory acceptability, I guess. So it creates an issue for us, and we try to still comply with the legislation, but also mitigate the risk of litigation by facially violating the Equal Protections Clause for Oregon. Moving on. I don't really have great recommendations for bridging the funding cycle gap. I will note that there are some funds like amusement and device tax that cross biennia. Those result from lottery proceeds and they don't expire for us. Those are such a small bucket of the total funds that we have. Federal funds also don't have to adhere to legislative cycles or biennia ending. It's entirely dependent on the federal allowable cost period for those funds. State general funds, though, that's where it gets, the legislation typically states for the biennium ending, June 30, 2025. That is a very frequent, in almost all of the legislation that is triggering the grant agreement that we're writing. And we're stuck with that. We can't violate that. So that really creates the hard deadline for us. Now, I'll cover this now. It's in a subsequent slide, but we could do grant agreements that are 4-year or 10-year agreements, especially when it's a repetitive project activity and purpose. The problem with that, though, is that we would have to amend it to refund it when we get new funding from the next biennium cycle. And when it doesn't expire like that, it creates an administrative burden on my grant administrators, not necessarily the procurement team, but our administrators, because it's an open grant agreement that they have to monitor, and they can't close out and forget about. It also creates an administrative burden on the grantees that we work with. And maybe that is worth it to them. But that's something we haven't really explored at all. So
Can you say more about that? Because I'm confused. If it's ongoing money, why would that be more of a burden? I'm confused by what you're saying. Because if it gets re-upped every biennium, why would that be a burden?
yeah, because so instead of, once a grant agreement is executed and you're getting towards the end of that performance period, the administrator would be looking to, receive the final report, ensure that all the money is paid out, check marking those things, and then sending a closeout letter. Once they send
It's
the
the
closeout letter,
okay.
yeah, the closeout process. Yeah. On both parties, you have to verify your financial records, and then, the is it easier to do an amendment to just add more funding and a description of the, new, which may be the same exact project activities just for a longer period of time? Is it easier to do an amendment, or cut and paste the prior agreement and update the date? It's to my team, my procurement team, I would say they're more or less the same. So,
But it isn't for us in the field because it takes forever to get the new one.
yes. So how do I put this? But
I'm sorry, I'm out of order.
No, you're fine. Yeah. So for everyone else's benefit, Heather is a frequent customer of Hex, so a frequent grantee. So we have a lot of great history together, and she has some wonderful insight into Hex processes. What I will say is that procurement has always been, in my agency, reactionary. So even though a bill comes through, funds, starting July 1, a grantee, procurement doesn't write the grant agreement until the program asks for it. So reactionary, right? So we are trying to flip that, especially with this last short session that just ended. We took a catalog of the bills that passed, which should result in grant agreements being drafted by the procurement team. And I'm reaching out to those program directors saying, hey, I already created, a file for this. I have assigned it to a teammate. We're starting to work on it. We need a procurement request form from you before we start routing this for signatures and send it off to Department of Justice. That way, that should alleviate some of the turnaround time. I will be honest with you, some of the programs are still submitting agreements to be drafted that were funded last July. So it's something that we're trying to change our process to be more proactive about, so that there's less on that. And part of that, I don't want to throw my programs under the bus. It's rare that that's the case. And I think they're just understaffed. We've recently done a huge bit of hiring. And so I think once those people are trained up, I think that will also alleviate that lag time. Okay. Whoop, skipped one.
So we are at 10 minutes, but I'll give you just another couple of minutes to wrap up.
Okay, great. I am not above acknowledging that we could always improve our process. I only see one side of the picture, and I think it's been several years since our agency has gone through a lean process tied to procurement. And I think that could be a beneficial process, even now, or on a set schedule. Definitely a better tracking system than a cloud Excel sheet for managing our grants and contracts. Like Smartsheet and stuff like those can automate some of those functions that we do, like sending out for signatures, but it requires a purchase, and purchasing IT anything requires pretty significant hurdles. That's all I'll say for that. I think I already covered that. I covered that. And I think this is an important point. Our agency usually has discretion. Are we going to award upfront funds or reimbursement only? Heavily dictated by the funding source. Federal funds often are reimbursement only. The exception to that is if the feds give us approval to deviate from that. They have with ARPA funds, which we've leaned into. We've given a lot of upfront funds on that. Alternatively, with state funds, we used to give a lot of upfront funds, but then we got burned by a lot of people in not completing their project activities in time. And part of that is a lapse on our administrators not checking in as frequently as they should have to ensure their grantees were spending it in the time frame that they had it. And so they were sitting on a pile of money at the end that we had to draw back, which is very difficult to get money back once it's in someone else's hands, and then revert it back to the legislature. And we didn't want to be in that position again. So by and large, we do reimbursement basis. We have allowed requests for upfront spending based on a spend plan across the entire grant performance period, and we would typically give the first quarter or first 2 quarters, depending on when the agreement is executed, upfront, or if there were any funds, fronted by the grantee, they would obviously need to be reimbursed as soon as possible. So we'd include that as well. I think that's it. That's it.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Next up, we have Department of Education. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Once again, I know I've introduced myself over several months, but I'm Kai Turner. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Finance and Information Technology at ODE. Next slide, Ian. So I'm happy that many of my colleagues went before me. I can probably get through this quickly, as some of our explanations will be no different than theirs. From a templated standpoint, when it comes to a standard procurement under the Public Contracting Code, we follow the DAS templates as provided. And when it comes to our request for application and grant agreements, we have developed templates with DOJ over time, and some of those templates look different based on the grant and the need for the grant. I have added a ODE grant template sample there for you to peruse at your leisure. Next slide, Ian. So legislative effect on contract language, typically from a standard terms and conditions standpoint, it doesn't change much. Now, legislative language can modify how a program is implemented and the different work that goes into that and how it can be complied with. But typically from a standard terms and conditions, it doesn't change materially. Next slide, Ian. All right. So recommendations for funding cycle and contract terms. As I've shared in the past, our primary book of business is funding school districts, which comes with a formula allocation base. With those, we can offer longer term contracts, likely competitive contracts. We can do that as well. The hitch here is biennial funding, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But it also depends on the different program managers and the program priorities that they have for that particular body of work in the granting process. Next slide, Ian. Relative to improving contract speed, I believe that transparency is necessary, especially with our legislative partners. I believe that oftentimes there is the impetus to get the dollars out the door as quickly as possible, especially with new programs. And what we have found at ODE is that it takes some time and community engagement to get new programs spun up. So we can't necessarily implement a program on July 1 that's new. That's a new initiative. We need some time to have conversations and think about how to implement that in a meaningful way. I would say mid-biennial start points for some new programs is efficient and effective so that we can get the necessary information to implement and make it successful and not have a failure to launch. Being in constant contact with DOJ and some of their rulemaking processes and arguably having a conversation with DOJ around any rules that are being implemented and the impact that it has on us from a contracting standpoint. I think that standardizing our templates and our processes internally is something that we are consistently looking at, and it's an iterative process that we learn from consistently. Standardizing training to staff. I'm not here to air dirty laundry, but I think that if we consistently work with our program partners and share with them any changes or offer more robust training on how to go through the contracting process, at least in the context of how we do it in ODE, could change some of those outcomes. And then also providing some of that technical assistance and outreach to vendors and our CBO community on how to find and respond to those particular solicitations. I was granted a training and outreach coordinator by way of short session in 2022. We are getting that person up to speed. And one of the things that I share with that staff member often is we need to meet the community where they are and not necessarily follow standard business hours. So that's something that I share with our training and outreach coordinator. Not everyone can show up at noon on a Monday for technical assistance, and sometimes it's after 5 on a Thursday. So there is that. Next slide, please, Ian. Drivers of language change, it's primarily for us is dictated by the funding source in itself. Typically, our grant and aid programs come with some level of strings attached to it. And then there are administrative requirements that we have to comply with based on the funding source. And there's also changes due to legal sufficiency, the budget process, and any lessons learned from previous iterations of implementing the program, as well as any community engagement we do on our items like our student success plans that deal with the CBOs and districts, the like. Next slide, Ian. Extending contract approvals. So our standard terms and conditions, as mentioned by my colleagues earlier, do have non-appropriation of funds clauses, et cetera, et cetera. Those are places in which we can extend for both our non-competitive and competitive programs. Going back to the formula allocations, we at ODE largely fund school districts. Therefore, we take average daily membership weighted and apply that on the student population. And for many things, that is how we distribute funds to districts. Extending contracts out also requires more closely monitor performance and additional reporting from our partners that we are granting to. Simply because as you straddle biennia, and I think Derek alluded to this, is that we close out one performance period, we're opening another performance period based on an amendment. We need to stay in concert and tight sync with our grantees to make sure that all of the conditions are met for that particular funding stream. One thing that I did want to share that I made note of on a sticky note that I have a unique vantage point on compared to some of the previous presenters is I am also over our finance team. And one of the things that I don't think many folks realize is that when we do the biennial switch, there is a period in time where we get our appropriations, and then we have to reconcile our appropriations. And with these massive pools of money and the size of ODE, at least, the reconciliation process can be long. So we want to make sure that whatever is appropriated to us is reconciled back to our finance system, and we want to get it as close to the dollar as possible. And it makes it difficult to then turn and pivot towards executing a contract, because sometimes in the reconciliation process, there might be issues with certain funding streams. And if we allocate to the amount that we think we have, we might have made a misstep. And we want to make sure that whatever we put into a contract is the gospel, so to speak. So we don't have to amend the contract again for a nominal amount of dollars, right? So that that legislatively adopted and approved budget reconciliation process from a finance standpoint can add to the timing of getting agreements out, and it doesn't always match to a July 1 out the door. So I just wanted to share that. And then next slide, Ian. We have the opportunity to offer upfront funding, and it typically depends on the funding stream. Everyone here knows federal funds are reimbursement basis. State funds, we have a little bit more wiggle room on that. And I think in many cases, it goes back to the appropriations. Some appropriations for grant dollars stipulate a reimbursement, some do not, and some are absent the language dictating how that happens. But as Mercedes pointed out, and I think they heard it loud and clear, is we assess risk. So a new program, a new grantee, an upstart CBO may present additional risks to up or front loading dollars to that particular entity. There's also priorities and objectives. We have over 109 grant programs, billions of dollars, and it's based on what the priority is in the moment of getting the contracts out the door. And then it goes back to the fiscal and performance accountability and any historical performance for those particular entities, and then legal sufficiency review. And then standard templates do include language for grantees to request an initial disbursement, but that is a smaller percentage, and it's likely based on the funding stream in itself. Next slide, Ian. Well, I think I beat 10 minutes, not totally sure, but happy to answer questions.
I think that was great. Thank you so much. We did have a question, but I think that's maybe more for a written response from all of the agencies, just about, I think we're hearing from folks around like the legislative engagement, and Representative Conrad has a question there in the chat that we'll ask everyone to opine on a little bit and share some reflection on how that information can be, reported back and forth in that process as well. So thank you very much. Odie, I appreciate that. And I want to reiterate the Dell comment there. Hearing about that reconciliation piece was also helpful in thinking about timelines. So appreciate you pointing that out. Next up, we have OHCS.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'm Tim Mahern Macias. I use he, him pronouns. I am with Oregon Housing and Community Services. I'm going to try and pop up this thing. And I just want to say, kind of at the beginning, I think a lot of the agencies have kind of gone over, we're kind of all in fairly similar boats. I start this thing. Okay, here we go. Can everyone see my PowerPoint okay? Okay. So again, I'm with Oregon Housing and Community Services. I'm Tim Macias, he, him pronouns. I'm our agency's tribal liaison. I'm also joined by Kimie Ueoka in our Affordable Rental Housing Division and Laura Al-Omrani from procurement. So contract templates. So we use a number of these. OHS, our procurement team has homeless services template, contract templates, grants to the tribes, as well as some program and offerings by legislative action. In addition to that, home ownership, which is one of the divisions at OHCS, has contract templates. Some of those live with procurement, some of them live within that division. Affordable rental housing development has some of those grants and templates, as so does affordable rental housing capacity building funding. And my apologies, I did not link the templates to this. I will follow up with the group afterwards to get those out. So the next big question is who writes and maintains these contracts. So procurement writes the contracts at OHCS. They then go through the approval process, legal sufficiency with the DOJ. And then procurement is the one who actually maintains those and updates those. We also utilize the DAS contract templates, the risk analysis tool and coverage templates. So that's who works on those. And I'm going to be going through these very quickly, so my apologies. So are any of these templates used by other state agencies? Yes. So the big one is the Enterprise Leadership Team templates. That was work in 2015 to help standardize contracts. And you can actually find those, I believe, on the website where all these meetings are held. And then some elements may have been shared or have been shared or used as a base for design. So an example is we have pulled in some contract templates such as ODE's language around tribal sovereignty, but we have also shared out our own template and language around negotiated indirect cost rate agreements with other agencies. I don't know if those have been utilized though. And that's again with regards to our tribal funding that we do out here. So how much does legislative language determine contract language and or create or disrupt templates that are used? So we regularly are making changes to templates based on legislation and statute, e.g. The requirements, state standards, and policies. It also depends on the legislation and level of detail and direction contained. And legislative changes have greater impact on the solicitation documents. So around that aspect. Let's see. Oops. Okay. Does your agency have recommendations on how to bridge different funding cycles that affect contract terms and funding sustainability, biennial funding source, emergency funding, et cetera? So obviously we have the big legislative limitation to crossing the biennium. So I think the two big pieces are utilizing resources that are not tied to the biennium that can help bridge those cycles. So for example, with that ARH capacity building funding, that is not tied to a biennial budget. The funding for that is from document recording fees. And so because of that, we are able to kind of bridge or have longer contracts for those grantees. The other big thing that can help is having some more policies or reforming our policies related to advances. Even though our agency can do advances, it's not very common. And I don't know if there's necessarily a set of, you follow these 3 checklists and then you're going to get your advance. It's something that almost is on a case-by-case basis. So what recommendations does your agency have for improving the speed of review and execution of new or existing contracts? So I think the biggest one is more staff, both from on our procurement side as well as DOJ. So I think the biggest thing is, especially at OHCS, staffing capacity has not yet caught up with the increase in funding to distribute here and programs to kind of start up. So that's a huge one. We also could work on process improvements. So having program do earlier planning and collaboration with procurement. So procurement isn't just, being caught by some big program that they have to try and get out the door. The standardization of templates, more staff training is a huge one. Another key piece is succession planning. I think sometimes agencies, and when I say agencies, I'm speaking to my experience here at OHCS, you have very experienced subject matter experts who, when they leave, kind of leave a huge hole that's difficult to fill for people to come in and know the processes, know the policies, all that stuff. And so it's really important that we do better at that. And the other big one is a grants management system. That would be, I think, we view it as really important to help improve kind of this process and what it looks like and getting money out the door. So what drives contract grant language changes from year to year? So template change drivers noted in the slides previously. We also have policy and procedure for template changes that outlines like what are the criteria or would trigger it. Exhibits driven by program and project. I'm not in here, but a huge thing that also does it is stakeholders or the grantees. So I'll use an example. We have a program called BAFI-NATO, which directly allocated homeless services funds to the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. We did our first 21-23 program. And then as we go through the 23-25, the tribes requested a number of changes to kind of the grant and the program guidance. So having to go through, make those changes, work internally, work with the DOJ and procurement to make those changes is an example of like, when has this language changed and why did it change? There's also changes that staff can make based off kind of their internal processes or what they're seeing internally. So what are the conditions that would need to be present to approve a contract for 24 months or more? So we already do this, but the biggest thing is just not being tied to the biennial budget. The other thing is non-appropriation language and templates. And yeah, I'll be totally honest, one of the biggest struggles I think we have, and we hear from partners, is covering this period. So there are also special circumstances that can happen that would lead to this. And I'll give an example again of BAFI-NATO, which stands for By and For Initiative, Native American Tribes of Oregon. When we did this long kind of engagement process with them, it was originally a reimbursement model, as most of our programs are. And as we came to the kind of wrapped up the DOJ component, the procurement component, the consultation and engagement, we realized it only left tribes with about 4 months until the end of the biennium. And some of the models that the tribes follow does not allow for reimbursement. They can only look forward from when a grant is signed. So a number of tribes were kind of in risk of losing this really critical homeless services dollars. And so we were able to amend the contract to advance the funds and then give them an additional 2 years until the 23-25 biennium ended to spend down those dollars. So I want to be very careful in how I kind of say this, that like these things can be done, but they're not very common. And they can sometimes feel like too hyper specific in order to get that advanced and go beyond 24 months. So that is my very, very, very brief presentation. Are there any questions about that?
I don't see any questions for you in the chat. Okay, we can go ahead and take one. Go for it, Lisa.
Thank you. And I apologize if I missed it. I saw on your slide you mentioned a grants management system, I think. And I think you're the first person to mention that as, or the first agency to mention that that's something that might be needed to address some of this. I was hoping you could talk more about that.
Yeah, I think Kimie Ueoka is on, and she can maybe speak a little bit more to that. Kimie, are you there?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimie Ueoka. I'm the Senior Capacity Building Analyst for the Affordable Rental Housing Division. I manage a subset of funds from our General Housing Account Program that are entirely dedicated to building capacity in our some of our partner entities. Speaking as a program manager, one of the observations that I've had, and I have seen this and spoken with other grant administrators within the agency, is a real need for a grant management system or database. I've interacted with others in other agencies and in other nonprofit spheres and philanthropic worlds, but really something that would create some additional kind of like underpinning support for the grant administrators, as also some consistency for external partners, and would allow us to, as an agency, really have this kind of system that spans across divisions. We have 3 major divisions doing very different bodies of work, but oftentimes interacting with the same pool of partner organizations that are working through the continuum of housing in some way or another. So I think on a number of levels, it would increase internal capacity and consistency, both for us as grant administrators internally, and also for our external partners and how they, upload and provide documentation, how they interact and engage with grants from the agency. And so it's something that that has been on my program manager wish list.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that very much. I think we have heard from a couple of presentations this question about a grant management system, and I do appreciate that it's coming up. I was in a meeting the other day, and someone I think very acutely mentioned that we, especially around housing and homelessness, we talk about this as if it's a system we want people to move through, from shelter to housing, social supports, but then we fund each of those differently on a different schedule with different requirements, different reporting, but yet we still expect our community to be able to move through them seamlessly, right? And so, like, how do we shift gears in some of those places? Thank you very much, OHCS, and OYA. We'll invite you up to close us out on this part of the agenda.
Thank you, everyone. Is everyone able to hear me okay and can see my presentation?
Yeah, looking good.
Awesome. Great. I'm Katie Hudson. I'm OIA's Chief Financial Officer, and I'll be going over OIA's contracting language today. Hopefully, if my presentation will go to the next slide. Oh, no. Are you all just seeing that first title screen still?
Yes.
Oh, no. Sorry, give me just one moment. I'm not sure why the slides are not advancing. There we go. So OIA does a variety of contracts. I just wanted to share real quickly that OIA, we have this sort of explanation of what type of contracts we do, and we ask folks, like, anything you would do to take care of a family member, those are the type of contracts that we we explore in terms of providing services to youth. So we do medical, we buy shoes, we buy clothes. We also have sort of the agency side of operations. So we do construction, we build buildings. So OIA contracting sort of just runs a range of all different types of contracts or grants. And to do those types of things, we do use 2 categories of contracts with sort of 2 contract types within those. So the first main contract templates would be like for personal services, and then our grant template. The other types of templates we might utilize that have more specificity would be our project specific agreements and contracts, and then those price agreements and service orders that DAS has the templates for that we're required to utilize. So our personal services contract template, OIA uses the template provided by DOJ, and then we add our specific exhibits and other specific details to the contract on the OIA side. In terms of who maintains that, it is maintained by OIA procurement. It's usually given to 1 procurement staff, a PCS 3. So the PCS ranges are 1 through 3, with our 3s handling the leadership and the complexity of contracts. So they also maintain the templates to make sure that we're still following DOJ's requirements and making sure that they're accurate to the work that we're doing, or it's accurate to the outcomes we're expecting from our contractors. This individual is responsible for monitoring any changes that come from DAS or DOJ, and it's a requirement that they update the contracts as necessary to make sure that when we're pulling these templates, that they're already updated and we're not having to worry about what's updated and what's not. Our grant template, it was written by OIA, and then we submitted it to DOJ for review and approval before we implemented, just to make sure that it met the legal sufficiency requirement and also represented what we're limited to in terms of our statutory authority on grants. Same sort of process for maintenance. It's assigned to a PCS3 procurement staff to maintain and update as needed. And really, it's those PCS3s or the procurement managers, like the single point of contact for updating templates and confirming that contracts or agreements are legally sufficient and ready to be utilized. We have project-specific agreements and contracts. These are for the OIA specialized services. I guess most complex example is our behavioral rehabilitation services, or other youth services contracts. They're very specific in that each level of service requires a lot of additional language, exhibits, rates. It's essentially created for each of the providers. We do have base templates that we start with, but there's a lot of nuance into the work that our folks are doing. And there's new territory that we're exploring. So as we're going through and trying to develop systems of care that are culturally responsive, or, you know, trying to put that into our contract language, it's new territory for a lot of agencies. So we essentially build off of a template, but then we submit any additions or things that we want to add through DOJ and get advice on what we're able to work with. And it's a lot of back and forth to get it just right for us and for legal sufficiency. Price agreements and service orders. So OIA does use the DAS purchase order, work order templates as required under specific contracts. So DAS will write and maintain a lot of different templates, and we included some examples. So Oregon Forward contracts, organizational change management purchase agreements, Cabendus, U-Work purchase agreements or price agreements. Anything that's under a price agreement, we utilize DAS's templates. So, so other state agencies in the legislature. So the main personal services template and the price agreement templates are used by a lot of state agencies as required. There are some requirements that we utilize what's provided and not build our own. Legislative impact varies. We do see changes that do affect standard contract language or grant language, and we make updates as needed. It can be a little bit disruptive in that there's often not a lot of turnaround time That's makes it easy for us to consult DOJ, make the updates, and then be able to roll it out without delays. The delays can sometimes be significant, especially for that reapproval of DOJ. A good example of how we try to navigate this. So we had a bill that was going through this past session that we were watching in terms of being able to make capacity payments to providers in behavioral health. And Oregon Youth Authority is limited by statute on how we do payments. And we're fee for service. It is very specific in our statute that we're fee for service. And so capacity payments were beyond our statutory authority. And so DOJ was kind of advising us, like, if this passes, we don't know if you have the authority to actually be able to do it. So we were kind of bringing up, well, how would we operationalize that? Like, how do we make the adjustments? Because the way the bill was written, it had a July 1 effective date. And we were sort of being held accountable to get our providers paid from that day on, but we didn't have the statutory authority to actually pay them in that way. So these are conversations that we had as like, how do we make that happen when there's conflicting legislation? So that's a really good example of the legislative impacts that we have to kind of review for contracting. So funding cycles, similar to other agencies, we do rely on the non-appropriation clause within our contracts to be able to have contracts that are 2, 3, 4, up to 5 years. And in terms of funding, our agency has sort of had to develop an internal practice and conversation about if we don't get funded, our priority will always be youth services, service to youth. So if for some reason we had these contracts that were extended through several biennium and we were, funded in a way that we couldn't maintain all of them, our agency has to go through like a prioritization process of like, how do we tie what we're funding in terms of contracting to the mission of our agency, and which of course will always be those youth services. So we've had to develop internal process of like, if it does happen, how do we ensure these continue to be funded to meet the mission of our agency? I would love to hear some more thoughts from others about maintaining stable funding associated with this, but we are beholden to what we're funded for, and we can't go above what we're funding for just because we have that contract in place. So that non-appropriation clause is important based on what we have the authority to fund by the legislature. Things that drive changes within our contracting, so changes in federal law and statute rules, sort of like I described with the recent bill that we were examining. Agency changes in policy and language preference. So we frequently, through a policy committee or through other operational evaluations, we'll kind of go in and see, is this still relevant? Do we need to create a new policy, which sometimes leads to contract amendments and changing contract templates. We do rely heavily on lessons learned and best practices. So if we do end up getting some sort of litigation experience, or we do an audit, we always want to make sure that we're applying what we learned to how we do contracting. If DOJ gives us different guidance, we update our contracts and our grants as necessary. A good example is DOJ recently gave us guidance on our grant authority and the specificity behind it, and gave us clearer outlines of what we were actually able to fund. And so we immediately applied that to our application review and made sure that we were doing as DOJ suggested. There were some prior grants that potentially wouldn't have met those guidelines, but we just didn't have clarity around the specificity. So we're always making sure that we update our processes as necessary. Approval for 24 plus months, like what needs to be present in order to be able to do those longer term contracts. We definitely want to make sure that the programming is long term and that sort of long term service type is appropriate. We make sure that we have the competitive process under ORS 190 or special procurement, and it really is dependent on the service and the conditions that need to be met of that contract. So we evaluate it individually to make sure that's appropriate for the contracting type. upfront and startup funding. OIA does provide startup funding, but not through our contracting, but through our grant process. And it has those specific qualification metrics that are based in our statutory authority. So this does set a requirement that it's for starting up a program that will be directly contracted with us to do services to youth. And we did start adding recently to our contract agreement that we require folks to continue to do work with OIA for a certain period of time to be able to not have to repay the grant funds. We want to ensure sustainability of programming for our youth. And so we ask that folks continue to do business with OIA for 2 to 3 years after the grant startup funds are given, because we want our youth to have that sustainable provider. We made some recommendations just kind of based on what we're trying to do at the agency level, and some of these items could maybe translate for all agencies. We did notice that we would like a expedited way for our DPO and for DOJ to review items. Items get caught in review between the two places quite frequently, which there are a lot of factors behind that. Staffing, several people using one DOJ representative. We would love to start developing standard agency templates for frequent contract types. That's work that we're doing now. Create standard exhibits for folks to add to contracts. So depending on the service, having available exhibit templates for folks to utilize that have already been pre-approved would be really helpful. So for medical contracts, youth-specific services, making sure there's a good resource for building blocks for contracting out there. Load frequently referenced agency forms to an external agency site so contractors have access and it's actually navigatable. It's hard in some of these sites to find what you're looking for. They're not very intuitive, and it's a struggle to have folks be able to find exactly what they need. So revisiting that. Setting internal procurement standards for maintaining consistency across contracts. We're doing a lot of work in making sure that every contractor has a similar experience, but at the same time, making sure that we're available to have standards of how we serve our vendors and our contractors in terms of like if they need extra help in navigating, we're there for them. Establishing agency procedures for ensuring any variations or deviations are noted, and we keep a record of that just so we are able to communicate that to providers and what the status is, but also so if we've visited this before, we're not wasting time in the agency of doing the same steps over and over again, keeping records of what we've reviewed and already had to change in the past and applying that to future contracts. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. I don't see any questions for you in the chat, but we will definitely let you know if we end up with anything where we need a little bit of a written response. Thank you so much. All right, group. So we're going to go ahead and take a break. We'll take a break until, we'll take a 10-minute break until 11:15. So please come back at 11:15 and we will do our DAS risk mitigation presentation. Okay. Uh, let's come back if we can. If you are here, just throw up a little thumbs up so I know I'm not alone. And we'll ask Das to go ahead and jump in with our risk mitigation presentation. Is that going to be you, Bonnie?
Yes, there you go. I got to unmute myself. Sorry about that. So it's Bonnie Robbins, and I work in the DAS risk management area, and I'm one of the managers. So I manage the consulting unit. We answer a lot of questions that come through around, contracts and grants. So today I'm going to give you some really high level information. Just it's information only. I'm not advising anybody on any insurance that they should get, but we'll go over some high level information today. And I'll watch the chat as I do that so I can answer some questions, and we'll get started. Is that okay, Mercedes? Is that all right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Sorry for my gravelly voice. I have allergies like everybody else right now. It's like, so if it's not projecting well, let me know. Okay, let's move on this presentation here. I'm really going to go over 4 things today, insurance terminology, just so you can understand a little bit of some terminology in the commercial insurance marketplace, some of the policies that we ask for in our contracts and grants, and give you some information about those on the commercial side, how our risk assessment toolkit works. I've got it hyperlinked in this presentation, so we'll go in there. We'll go over the indemnity clause too that's in our contracts and grants, our general indemnity clause. And all of this is really risk mitigation or risk transfer techniques that happen as we do contracts and grants and pay for people to do for the state. We do transfer, that exposure to the contractor or grantee who's doing the work, because we're not doing that. So let's get started. And if I'm off on that, Mercedes or team, let me know. So there's only like 2 slides here. I thought I'm not going to get too technical today because who wants to? I mean, I geek out on it, but not very many people geek out on this insurance stuff. So there are a couple of different pieces of terminology that might be helpful. There are 2 general types of insurance policies you can buy in the commercial marketplace. And they're occurrence-based or claims-made. Occurrence meaning that if a claim is filed for an injury or property damage, at any time due to one of your policies, it can be filed after the policy even expires. So you can file a claim against somebody who has an occurrence-based policy, or you as the owner of that policy can file that claim if somebody says you've done something to your insurance carrier even after the policy expires. So I would say, keep your policies for periods of time. Claims made is different. And we see those mostly in the professional liability area. Those really end when the policy expires, unless you do some kind of an endorsement to extend it out. And the coverage is activated when the injury occurs after the start of the policy, but before the end of the policy. So really restrictive in what that type of policy does, and it doesn't really open up the broad opportunity to file claims later. But it really is an industry piece, and in some kinds of coverages, you can't get occurrence, generally in the professional environment. All right, and one more slide, just to help with terminology, and then we'll move on. Occurrence. So occurrence, you got occurrence in aggregate, mostly on your policies, and things that we ask about is occurrence in aggregate. So occurrence is how much an insurer or the insurance carrier would pay on a single claim, the maximum they would pay. And the aggregate is the maximum they would pay out on your policy at any period of time that policy is open. Generally, they're 1-year policies, except for in construction. So if you have a 1 million occurrence on your general liability policy, they'll only pay a claim up to $1 million. And then aggregate would be the 2 million, and they would pay no more than 2 million in your for your general liability policy, as an example, in your policy year. And then combined single limit, we see that more on the auto liability side. It's a single dollar limit that applies to any combination of bodily injury or property damage associated with that policy. And we mostly see that in the auto side of it, commercial auto. Right, so you're so excited. I'm going to keep going. Nothing in chat. I'm going to move now on to some insurance policies. I know that was very brief because I don't want to overwhelm you with insurance terminology. But we're going to talk about just some of the insurance policies that we generally ask for regarding our contracts and grants. We're going to talk about commercial general liability. What does it cover? What does it provide you? Auto liability, professional liability, and workers' comp. I did not do Sam or Pam. If you want to talk about abuse and molestation, let me know that. We can talk about that. So we're going to move on. Commercial general liability. It's really for your operations in your business, for your ongoing and completed operations. So those of you that own businesses, this is something you think about all the time. What's your operations? What's your exposure? How can I get some financial backing? And insurance policies from the commercial side provide you some of that financial backing that you need and the legal resources that you might need if a claim comes. And these are really great policies for that. There are 3 coverages, and then there's a contractual liability coverage that's been around since 1986. So when we talk about a bodily injury, it's if something happens in your business, whether it's ongoing or completed, and somebody gets harmed, bodily harm, some part of their body gets harmed, that is coverage A, or property damage of others, not yours, but somebody else's. And then coverage B really is that personal and advertising injury, defamation of character. Just think about that, slander. That's where you get some coverage for that as well. And then there's coverage C's. There's the goodwill part of these policies, medical payments. Somebody slips and falls in your, where you own a building, or you're leasing property, slips and falls or trips over something that you own. This policy generally comes with some medical payments. Goodwill is what they really kind of call it. $15,000, $10,000, something like that, to pay for somebody's medical expenses for something that may have happened at your site. It's a great way to do that, and that's been around a very long time. And then the other thing that is in commercial general liability is contractual liability coverage, and it's been around since 1986. There are 2 exclusions. It has to be a contract you have with somebody else, not your contract that you've given to somebody else. So for those that are not with the state, but you contract with the state for business, this would be a coverage you should have in your commercial general liability policy is contractual liability coverage. It would be coverage you would receive for contracts that you agree to do work for others. It's just for the state, we self-insure for everything, but if you have an insurance contract for a subcontractor, that would not apply here because that's your insured contract with another party or any liability that would exist without a contract. Any questions on that? Okay. You're either having a great time drinking caffeine.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Bonnie, I think what would help me is and maybe you know this off the top of your head and maybe you don't, but understanding where these are encouraged versus where you will not be approved to move forward with your contract or grant agreement without these in place.
Right, and this is one of those. DAS risk management has really looked at exposures like tort claims we receive that are due to other people's contracts. And this is one that we have said, this is a requirement. You need to have a minimum of 1 million, 2 million coverage in commercial general liability, or you won't move forward. And we can look at the risk assessment toolkit. It's built to make sure that's there. And it really provides the owner of the business resources that you don't have otherwise. And when we get to the end of this, you'll understand we have a statute that says we have to subrogate against whoever the contract or grant was for. Even if if a third party files a damage against the state of Oregon, it's not ours and it's somebody else's. We have to go after them, and we would just send that then to the insurance carrier associated with this. So yes, this one is required. This is the only one that's required, except for workers' comp if you have employees. And there is Dolly's got a statement in here. We do tell CBOs that they can use our grant funds to pay for the insurance that we as the state required. That's true. And some agencies do that, which is nice. It can be helpful for new and small business, small CBOs. And this is really not just for your contract with the state, right? This is a business policy. It covers you as a business owner for the business work that you do, the operations that you do, or anything you do. Yep, I'm going to move on. I'm not going to talk, but that is about using grant funds to pay for insurance. And we can talk about that a little bit if you want. These are some of the exclusions in that commercial general liability policy. You know, it doesn't pay for, you know, professional liability. If you have a professional business that you're doing, and we have some examples in a moment, like attorney. No, I don't know if there's any attorneys here, or architect, engineer, or a CPA, because we're all doing taxes right now. That kind of professional work that's done is excluded from this kind of policy. It's also called errors and omissions. Pollution, you know, you pollute something out there, and aircraft, auto. And so I put a few examples here. Your own property is not there. Any criminal act would not be covered here. If you have employees that have access to your checkbook or something, you wouldn't get coverage here. They would probably tell you that right away. Any infringements on copyrights, patents, trademarks, and any employee injuries, because that shows up in the workers' comp side, and abuse and molestation is specifically excluded here. And there could be more. These are not all the exclusions, but these are the ones that really are good to understand. Here's professional liability. It's also known as errors and omissions. E&O, sometimes it's referred to E&O, but it's for professionals. And it's liability insurance designed to protect the professional and the organization that the professional works for. Generally, you'll see CPA firms, you'll see attorney firms, you'll see firms about that. Or if you have a business and you are working and have a professional perspective with the work you do, this would be something you would want to have. It's for anyone giving advice, specifications, developed blueprints, think architect, engineer, and any other professional stuff. And I did provide some examples here. Doctors would be in there too, but we call those medical malpractice policies in that kind of realm. Interior designers can also be considered professional liability, professional in their nature, and depending what they're doing, could also need this. And they're generally claims made coverage, and that's why I did the definitions early on. And I would say talk to your insurance agent. They know really. They're also professionals, and they have E&O exposure, so they're going to make sure they really go through a checklist with you and your business to make sure they don't have their own exposure there. Okay, I'm going to move on because these are the exclusions. They exclude bodily injury or property damage of others. That's where the commercial general liability comes in. They won't provide that coverage, but commercial general liability will. And then you see some of the same exclusions that you see in the commercial liability side as well. I'm going to move on because I don't know that Mercedes. I don't know if you want me to answer their question now or wait. You want to talk about that one later or wait?
Yeah, no, I was kind of putting it out there for the agency folks. That's why I was like, any agencies in the chat, like, just because we're hearing from some folks that they'll let them pay for the insurance with the grant fund. So I'm just wondering if there's anyone else who's like, no, we need that up front.
Okay, sounds good. All right, here's a commercial auto insurance component. And it's on the commercial side. You can get business endorsement on your personal auto policy. Just so you know, talk to your agent about it if you don't have it. If you're using your personal vehicle for business purposes, it's a good idea to get that. Kind of covers any business actions as well. But we're talking about commercial here and not personal lines. The auto insurance on the commercial side covers the physical damage. Your auto gets rear-ended or you rear-ended somebody else and the auto needs to be replaced. You'd see that coverage here. Any liability coverage, you harm somebody else, you rear-end somebody else, or something happens, the coverage is found here on the auto side. Uninsured and underinsured, I don't know if you know, but still we have 25% of the people driving cars around that do not have insurance. And that's where this coverage comes in, and it comes in on your personal auto as well, uninsured or underinsured. So sometimes your medical expenses might be more than what the minimum requirements are in Oregon, and you get that from the commercial side or your own personal auto side. And PIP is really the medical component that comes in for you, the insured who owns the policy. Not a lot, but it's a little bit of coverage for you. And then we have the non-owned and hired autos, and I'll just kind of give some examples there. Non-owned auto could be an employee. You have an employee who's using their own vehicle to do an errand for the business. That would be considered a non-owned auto. And you would have some coverage for that employee using their personal vehicle, because if they didn't do the business endorsement on their own personal auto policy, there might be a little gap in coverage for them. And then hired auto, I just put rental vehicle there, and that is for liability coverage only. This does not cover physical damage for the hired auto, which is rental vehicle most of the time. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. And then we got workers' comp. And that's, provides a benefit for the worker when they get injured while they're working for the employer, which is wonderful. It also means that the employee cannot file a liability claim against you because it is a sole remedy type of product. If it's a sole remedy insurance policy, and it was set up that way in 1913, very long time ago. It has certainly changed since 1913 over the time, but they can't file a negligence claim against you as the employer. They can't file it against us, the state of Oregon, either. And we do have a few claims that come that way. And I'm not a lot about workers' comp. I know a lot about workers' comp, but those the two things to really remember there. Yes, Mercedes, I'm almost done. These are just the other specialty type of insurance policies, and I can send this to you, Mercedes, if you want to, but there's crime and there is abuse and molestation, sometimes called physical abuse and molestation, sometimes sexual abuse and molestation, lots of different words for it. There is insurance for aviation and drones. And then Bailey's is, if you have somebody's property and you're doing some work on it, you would want that kind of coverage. And then the bottom two are builder's risk is really about construction projects and ensuring the property and the construction work that's being done. And then we talk about umbrella and excess liability going on top of things to give more coverage and more limits. We're going to go to the risk assessment toolkit, and then I'm almost done after that. If you go to our homepage, and we'll go there in a moment, you will see there are 4 different columns. These 3 are sitting on top, and the risk assessment actually sits under contracts and risk assessment. So I'm going to go to our homepage real quick. Hopefully, there we go. This is what our homepage looks like. And we scroll down here. This is for state agencies only. If they have a question, they send that through the Origami portal. But this is public facing. So you can go in and look at it if you want to. Just click right here, and it brings us to our different toolkits. We have quite a few different ones. But we're going to go to the insurance and goods risk assessment toolkit. These are the templates that are used in grants and goods, grants and contracts as like an exhibit B, really explaining what kind of insurance is needed and the type amount of that insurance. So let's go here real quick, because I know I'm on a time limit. There's different tabs. This is the instructions, and there's a start here, and we're going to go directly to services. This one is really to think about what kind of exposure there is. If you want to look at the assessment, you can certainly do this, but here's the services one, and I just want to go through quickly. Lots of flags to explain things. But if you look at the commercial general liability piece, the agency's subject matter expert, or sometimes the procurement people actually fill this out. They answer these questions. What kind of work is going to be done? What could happen? So even if we entered 0 in every one of these, nothing's going to happen. It's going to still give us what's required, which would be 1 million, 2 million. You really have to get it. It really scores based on a score of 0 to 10, 11 to 17, or over 18, and it really looks at exposures and potentials there. So I encourage you to go in there and look at it. We have this for lots of different reasons, IT and construction as well. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint real quick here a minute.
So Bonnie, just quickly on that, does it only give you a recommendation for general liability and not all of those other types of insurance?
It gives it for all of them. I'm sorry, Mercedes, I'm just trying to make sure I've got time, but let's go back in there real quick. It has, after commercial general liability, you scroll down, it has quite a few different types of insurance and lots of questions about that insurance. And it ultimately gives you a summary sheet that the procurement person or the subject matter expert can give to the procurement person to fill out the actual insurance requirement form. So I'm going to scroll through. Here's the statement about workers' comp. This one's about commercial general liability. You can continue to scroll down. You got the auto liability questions. What are the questions? And these flags really provide, what are we talking about? Why is this so important? On each one of those, so every time you fly over a flag, it will come up with some additional information, but we're trying not to goop up everything else. And this one, you put some numbers in here based on the question, what the answer is. It will again, I'm just going to go put some random numbers in here. It will again determine for the person who's filling it out what the limit should be for that type of coverage. And we'll look at the summary sheet in a moment. We've made it as simple as we can based on our knowledge. And we worked with our insurance broker on this too. And here's for hospitals and medical for professional liability. But if you scroll down, this is the other liability questions around professionals, except for IT. We have a special one for IT. You just answer the questions and put your one, it's either a 0 or a 1 here. Tab through. This one's got a 4. I'm just putting numbers in. I'm not even answering questions here. So and this in here. And again here, it like red marks it and says, hey, you're at a 9, so it's going to be 5 million, 10 million. And you may want to look at what you're answering, how you're answering those questions there. And then here, because that we have them put those in there, you put 5 million and 10 million. And you keep scrolling. I'm not going to answer anymore because we just don't have a lot of time, but you can go through as the directors and officers, crime, physical abuse molestation, motor carrier cargo, drones, it just goes aircraft. We've done a lot of work to really build this out, and it's pretty hefty. I can tell you we've received some acknowledgement for this at the state and nationally at the Public Risk Management Associations. Others are using it. Rhode Island's just asked for it. So it's helpful. And then you go here and you just print this off, and this is what's given to the procurement person or whatever documentation they need to actually fill out the insurance exhibit form. So we're not asking them to guess. If there's questions, they always send it our way. Does that help, Mercedes?
Yes, thank you very much for going through the different sections that were there. In this summary document, does it give you a sense of how much that costs?
No, because we don't. It would depend on your insurance agent, their insurance carriers, what the markets they have. There's no way to do that, really, not at all. And sometimes they're in business owner package policies. You can see that a commercial general liability and auto liability might be in the same policy as a package, so that you get more than one type of policy for the same amount of money. But there's no way. There's a lot of carriers. There's domestic and there's London and there's Bermuda. The only reason I know that is because we do the insurance with the state as well. So there would be no way for us to figure out and give any idea how much those would cost. I know that, however, I'm a licensed insurance agent, so I can say commercial general liability, depending on what you're doing, a small business doing whatever you're doing, because that's also classified and rated that way. It might be anywhere from $300 to $750, except for if you've got, kids, it might be higher depending on what you're doing. So even though $1.2 million looks like a lot, it's a pool. Everybody's in the pool. So, that brings the cost down, which is nice. Bring this one back in a minute here. Sorry, let me get to where I need to be. There's that one. And then we are on to, and then there's types, right? We kind of scan through that on that sheet. I'll send this your way, Mercedes. You guys can click in here and look at the different types we have for goods and services, or services and goods. Mostly services is used here, not goods. IT, I know they use them for IT and all the construction projects. And why does it matter? It's my last slide. Because you're agreeing to an indemnification paragraph. There's a paragraph in your contract or grant that says you're gonna, based on subject to ORS 180, that you're gonna hold the state harmless. You're gonna indemnify the state and the agency for any damages or lawsuits or anything like that. so the insurance piece is your financial backing, right? We don't want to have to go after you. I don't want to. It's about, and you need to really look at your business operations, not just about what you do with the state, but what do you do as a business? Work with your insurance agent on what that exposure is. They're really good at it. They're licensed to do this kind of work. And then we have ORS 278052 that says if we get a tort in, it's not due to the state, we have to go after the person and sue them to get the money back. And if you have insurance, we just, what we call tender the claim right to the insurance carrier, and they would take care of it on your behalf. And I've got a quick story. Do I have just like 2 minutes? Because I owned my own business with my husband here in Salem for 26 and a half years in the plumbing industry. For a very long time. And we did have a claim. It was an auto liability claim. I told him many times, don't follow anybody close. We had one of those plumbing vans that had our name all over it. Great advertising and marketing. That's what you do. So he did. He ended up rear-ending somebody, but we had insurance and it was great that these people sued, and he worked with the insurance company and he had the legal representation he needed. It went all the way to where he was going to have to testify. He was deposed by the other side, and he was actually, worked with an attorney on the insurance carrier side to make sure he was prepared. He was terrified. It's not fun. He was terrified, and in the end, they did settle for about a $36,000 claim, is what it ended up being. But the lawyer fees on that are not included in that $36,000. That's just part of what you get. That's not even part of the limits on the auto liability or commercial liability. Probably an $80,000 claim, probably now in the late, I think it was early 2000s. And probably today would be worth about 150,000. There's just no way as a small business that we could have come up with that or even figured out who we needed to work with as an attorney. So my personal story, and I told my husband I use that. I have other personal stories about my husband, like chainsaws, has nothing to do with the business, but just silly things. I remind him of safety all the time. And this is my contact information. So I know I didn't have very much time really for informational purposes. And if you want this, Mercedes, or anybody does, I certainly will send it your way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we would love to have the presentation, just part of our kind of collection online that we've been collecting from different offices. We've got about 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes if I squint. If anyone does have any questions or some follow-up for Bonnie on this presentation.
You guys are easy. Thank you so much. I will send it to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good question or like how to phrase this question, but I did think it was interesting, kind of the way you phrased at the beginning, that the purpose of the risk transfer is because this is not the work the state is doing, right? This is the work somebody else is doing, even though it's been passed by some sort of legislation. It's being heavily regulated by a state agency. It's being heavily dictated what can and can't be done with every dollar that's associated with that. So it feels a little odd in my mind to create such a separation between, like, this is work that the state wants, has determined the people of Oregon need, have a right to, but it's not our work, right? It kind of sounds to me a little bit like Uber and Lyft being like, oh yeah, the drivers aren't employees.
Well, and I can tell you this is why, in some ways, agent of the state, right? You're not an employee of the state. You're not an agent of the state. You are an independent contractor, an independent business, and you want to stay that way. And so we can't defend you. We can't use our insurance fund in that manner, because we are highly regulated on how that money is used as well, and how we can engage with the agencies and the employees, but we can't defend or take on anybody else's exposures. So I guess maybe that's it, Mercedes. It's an exposure that we can't take on at least from the insurance fund perspective, and the insurance component of it, purchasing that is a protection for you as an owner of a business. And from an operational perspective, that, when we owned my own business, we talked about it all the time, my husband and I. What are you doing out there? I just need to make sure I got everything covered. And we would sometimes not agree to a contract, but most of the time we would. Okay, so I've got two people's hands up. Do you want me to answer those questions, Mercedes, or not?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do. Well, one of them I think is a person in the audience, and I'm not sure how to manage that. But Lisa, if you want to go ahead and jump in.
So I'm on the phone. This is Marianne, and
Marianne.
I guess it makes sense that I don't want them coming in telling me how to run my business, so therefore they don't have a way to limit their risk with the way I'm doing my program. So I think that makes sense.
Yes. We can't dictate who you hire, what your internal operations are, how you manage your checkbook, anything about that. I mean, there's exposures that we don't dictate. We do have statutes and rules on how we manage as agencies, but how you run your business and who you decide to hire and how you decide to do your work is yours. It's not something the state generally can do unless it's around a statute or a rule. Generally, I'm talking in generalities.
Lisa, go ahead.
I had a feeling today was going to be the one I was most confused at. Just be gentle. I think kind of building off what Mercedes was saying, I feel like I need some time to write this down, but so the state has this level of, doesn't want this level of exposure. I guess I'm getting stuck on what was said earlier in the chat about how the insistence of these insurance requirements can be paid for with state dollars, but like, is that agency by agency that decides that?
Each agency has your own budget, so that's not going to come from DAS Risk Management. That's going to come from the agency themselves and the authority they have around spending that money that they've been given, either whether it's a grant or a contract. So we don't have any authority around that at all. I don't know unless one of the agency representatives that was doing the chat can answer that question for you, but I believe it's agency by agency and budget and authority. You have to be careful how you spend the budget money.
Thank you. I think that's a big follow-up question I have. I want to be mindful that this was a fun opportunity for me to hear other perspectives about this experience and the level of exposure the state's going through, because I remember a couple summers ago when this was such a big topic, when there were some changes made and grantees were like, oh my God, I can't afford this. And so maybe that's a follow-up question for all agencies about, like, what do they allow the contractees to cover with state dollars? Am I making any sense, Mercedes? I need to know.
No, I think you really are, because like that's why I kind of asked the question, like, after you've gone through all of this process, does it tell you how much money you're asking your grantee to pay to get the grant? And if there's no insight into that, then why wouldn't you just mark like the highest numbers on each one, just in case, just to be protective, right? And then you may be costing an agency a couple $1,000s for a grant that also is only a couple of $1,000s, right? And so like, where's the right sizing of that? And I know that we had folks who turned away opportunities to be doing work with the state because those requirements were too high, and that we've lost organizations who are acting as kind of hubs and fiscal agents to help make it faster for us to get funds out, who are like, well, I can't do that anymore. And now we're not going to have that additional functionality. And so it does feel like there needs to be some way of having insight into what all those numbers that you're putting into that risk management spreadsheet, what that then costs your organization that should be your partner in that work. And I think that's where we're trying to figure out, like, how do we get to that information? And I'd love to hear from you, Bonnie, and then we'll take Dolly's comment and Bettina's, and then we will need to close. I need to at least show you guys what we're doing next month.
Yeah. So, I mean, because there was some questions about even how to get it, I did, and one of my I have a group of risk consultants, but only 4, 5 right now, to answer some of these questions for the agencies. But we did put a list of commercial insurance agencies that have the markets that can help you. But we're saying this is so hard to put any numbers around them because, you know, is it State Farm or Farmers? Is it Zurich? I mean, how big is your business? What are you doing? There's a whole underwriting component to it that we would not be able to do, or even because if we put a number out there and you can't find that number, then it's kind of like, well, that's not great either, because we're setting up some expectations that just can't be met. And the market right now is hard. I mean, it's getting better, but we're in an insurance marketplace that's still tight and hard and expensive. The state itself is experiencing that too. And so we understand that. We work with agencies then on some of these specific areas where they're having some problems to see if we can match the exposure a little bit better. But this is really meant for our, you know, it's meant to get like 90, hopefully 90% of those contracts and grants through. And then we may have 10% that we have to work as a one-on-one or a special project piece.
Yeah, and I do suspect agencies that are allowing for some of the grant funds to pay for the insurance are then going to have some data about what does it cost, whereas those who are not allowing that would have even less insight. So
Right.
Dolly, do you want to go ahead and share a little bit with us, and then we'll have Bettina close us out?
Hi, good morning. So I just wanted to say that I really think there's a big difference between grants and contracts. So I require grantees to have this insurance, and thus I'm telling them they can use our funds to get the insurance that's required. But as Bonnie said, it was very hard during COVID for some of our grantees to get the insurance that they needed, not because of us, but because of the insurance agencies. Now, I also have experience as a contractor, and the state, again, told me what I needed as a contractor, a private contractor to have. There was no money up front because that, again, is my business, right? And so no one's going to give me money up front. I think that's a really important difference to point out in this conversation.
Thank you. And Bettina, go ahead and take us out.
Yeah, my thoughts were similar. You know, we hold these contracts, we have to have these insurances, and I'm seeing a recommendation, you know, coming out of this, really saying, how do we build this in? Because insurance contracts are as difficult. You know, when the IT insurance requirements came, you know, it's hard to get contracts every year on year. It's hard because there's different requirements on how you manage your IT. And there's really, the smaller you are, the harder it is to actually live up to these insurance requirements to even get an insurance. So I think I can see a recommendation coming saying that these requirements are funded, you know, somewhere in the grant. And that those maybe have to be reviewed annually because insurance prices do go up, and you know, annually. Everyone gets reinsured annually, and sometimes the jump is 5%, and sometimes the jump is 2%. So I just see a recommendation coming saying this is an essential cost of operating, and let's just build it into the contract or grant price and make it as important as it is, because for early childhood, it was a huge piece. You know, when preschool promised, a lot of people opted out because they couldn't afford, because the contract price actually didn't allow for how expensive insurance can be. So I think it's really helpful for us to say this is a big topic, you know, payroll is, but this also is a pretty significant part of every contract.
Yeah. Thank you so much. All right, everybody, with about our last 5 minutes, we're just going to go over a little bit of what's coming up next. So coming into May, we're going to have some reporting requirements. That's our kind of last formal topic with the agencies. We're also going to pair that with a DOJ presentation. So similar today, some short presentations, and then a presentation there. And then in June, we're going to talk about a mechanism for ongoing review. Now, we can kind of determine whether or not we need information from the agencies to answer this question, but a lot of this is like, so the task force is going to end at some point. We're going to make a whole bunch of recommendations, some of which sound like agencies are kind of hungry for some of these changes. So how do we make sure that stuff happens? It'll take a couple of years for any changes to happen. So what are our recommendations for making sure work kind of continues to progress? And then between June and August, we're mostly going to be writing. We're going to be writing. We're going to be agreeing on what our recommendations are going to be. We'll need to make sure we have an agreed upon kind of decision-making process, and we may need to kind of discuss subcommittees in order to do some of that writing and get into detail. But we'll talk about that more at the May meeting. So here are the questions that were developed in the agenda planning meeting for the reporting requirements. And so these are going into just kind of like how you determine what you're requiring people to report. You know, is the legislation imposing that? Is it coming from your agency's priorities and what kind of information you're trying to collect? Wondering how much reporting is like grantee specific. I know there are definitely different times where in my agency, like we're actually kind of offering what the outcomes measurements, you know, should be, and other times we're being told what the outcomes measurement should be, right? And so trying to get a sense of how that's negotiated, where it plays out, how often it's tailored, how often it's really geared towards goals that the organization, that the agency is trying to meet. How often are we requiring audits? This is going to be separate from federal audits. So mostly thinking about in your state agency specifically, when do you require more of a state audit? We know there's lots of other things that spark other types of audits as well. We want to really kind of try to figure out how are we right-sizing reporting requirements with admin burden and tools, and like how much of this is compliance-based versus how much is outcomes-based. And then we, at the end there, we have like this big question about like there are multiple types of reporting that organizations are asked to do. I think sometimes they're all taken as silos, like, you know, your financial reporting for your invoices is separate from your quantitative reporting, which is separate from your qualitative reporting, which is separate from your audit. And so we're wondering kind of, do agencies look at all of the things they're requiring their grantees and contractors to submit, or are they just, is like one person looking at financials, somebody else is looking at the audit data, somebody else is looking at quantitative or qualitative data. And there's not necessarily a sense that like, oh, this one agency had to do all of these things. It's like only compliance-based, people looking for their compliance that they oversee. And then also wanting to know what's done with all of this information. You know, is this information analyzed and collated within your agency to, you know, produce a report that maybe you do that shows, you know, this is the impact of all of the programs that we're doing, or this is the impact of all of the youth programs we're doing, or this is the impact of all the youth programs during summer that we're doing. Like, is there any, like, what does that look like for the agencies as far as all of this data that's being collected on the financial side, on outcome side? You know, what happens to it? What are you doing with it outside of that individual relationship with the grantee? Obviously, there's a lot that happens with that information with that individual relationship, but kind of thinking about the higher level there. And then these are the survey questions. So again, we're doing a few kind of yes, no's. These are like high level summaries of some of the information that we're asking for in these different places. I'm going to pull this down real quick. And then I apologize for going through this so fast. Usually we'd try to do a little bit of like iterative review together, but we had so many good discussions today. And so then this last one, hopefully that's big enough. So these are the questions that we're going to try to send to DOJ. So we had a draft that we worked on together. We sent that to them for some feedback during the agenda planning meeting. We discussed some of that feedback, and then we developed this list here. So first I want to kind of clarify a couple of things. I added some pieces here at the top around essentially directions about what we're asking and what we're trying to understand, and then giving some parameters on how to respond to the question. Some of the feedback that we got from the DOJ staff was that the questions were kind of too big, kind of too broad, and we needed to be more specific about what we wanted to know. So then I did rewrite these questions with this, essentially with this phrase at the beginning. If we make a recommendation, this does not mean that these are task force recommendations. These are not recommendations that we've agreed on, built any consensus around. These may or may not end up in a final report. I phrased the questions this way to help get us to some answers that are really kind of about where the authority exists or doesn't exist for these different items. So we have our universal application questions. We've got a couple of wages questions, payment questions, and some practices questions. There were a set of structural questions that were really about the DOJ's staffing, how they review application or materials that are sent to them, how long things take, a lot of questions like that. We pulled that out of this sheet and we have given that to DOJ to be that presentation. So just like we've given the other agencies a set of questions to bring to a presentation, we've taken all those structural questions and we've moved them into a presentation so So what we're hoping for is something in writing on these questions and then a presentation on the structural questions. Since we didn't have a ton of time to go through this, I just want to check with folks. Are people okay with these questions going to DOJ as they are currently written? Or do we want to push the DOJ presentation to June so that we can have more of a discussion about this? So I'm going to ask people to just make a quick vote in the chat, either ready to go or wait. If you're ready to go, just write ready to go in the chat. If you want to wait, write wait. If we have kind of a plurality of the weights, then we'll pull this back. We'll tell DOJ we're going to ask them to come maybe in June and give our time in the task force and agenda planning some more time to review and refine these questions. All right, so far, 1, 2, 3, 4 ready to goes. I know I have more people here than that though.
Is what was sent by Amy the most recent version of this document, or has it been updated?
Yes.
Awesome.
No, what was attached to the agenda is this exact same one. Okay, I'm not seeing any weights. I'm not seeing anyone throw up their hands and be like, I really need us to have a larger discussion about this. So we're going to go ahead and move forward with this version of the questions. And with that, we'll call the meeting to a close. Thank you, fabulous people, for another 3 hours of your life. I super appreciate all of you for being here, asking questions and engaging. And I'm looking forward to the next couple of months when we start doing a lot of our discussion and a lot of our kind of landing the plane on the recommendations we want to send forward. Thank you all, and thank you all the agency staff who are here as well. Everyone have a great rest of your day.